Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Clare Lees. I'm the Director of the Institute of English Studies at the School of Advanced Study, the University of London, and I'd like to welcome you to this fifth and final panel in the school's peer review week on disciplinary and interdisciplinary change and peer review. We've got a fantastic array of speakers and experience with a wide range of disciplinary and multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary experience to share with you today. We'd invite you to put your comments and thoughts and questions in the chat, which we will pick up afterwards, and to remember to address those comments not just to the panelists in the chat, but to the attendees and panelists. The structure of this session is that each speaker will have 10 minutes. They'll each speak roughly to 10 minutes about how peer review and change within disciplines and interdisciplines keep pace or fail to keep pace with one another. As I say, each of our panelists today, this afternoon, will have 10 minutes to do that. Then we'll have a discussion, and towards the end, I will hope to pick up and curate from the chat your questions and comments. So our first speaker this afternoon is Jane Winters, Professor of Digital Humanities at the School of Advanced Studies, who was also the co-convener of SAS Peer Review Week with me. She's Vice President of the World Historical Society, a PI on the AHRC, IRC, UK, Ireland Digital Humanities Network project, which is a mouthful in and of itself, and she's a member for the one of the REF sub-panels in the current REF exercise. I think we've got a kind of full showing of REF expertise across this panel, so we're going to get lots of different ranges, spread of expertise. Then we will move to Jenny Richards, Professor Jenny Richards, Joseph Cowan Professor of English Literature at Newcastle University, director, where she also directs the Humanities Research Institute. Jenny is a member of the AHRC Advisory Board. She's chair of the advisory group. She was chair of the advisory group for the AHRC strategic theme, Care for the Future, until 2016. She's chair of the English Association's Higher Education Committee and a dear and much valued colleague of mine in all of those contexts. Professor Barry Smith is director of the Institute of Philosophy at the School of Advanced Study, where he also directs the most amazing and well-known globally Centre for the Study of the Senses. He's been the Leadership Fellow for the AHRC Science and Culture theme, and he is currently a member of REF 2021 Interdisciplinary Advisory Panel, or IDAP, as it's familiarly known. Barry brings to this panel a real set of experiences of thinking about interdisciplinarity, and I think that's really helpful. And our final speaker, last but not least, Teal Triggs, is Professor and Associate Dean of the School of Communication at the Royal College of Art, where she is also postgraduate research lead for her SINs. She is also currently Associate Editor of Design Issues. She was previously co-editor of the Journal of Visual Communication, both of which embrace the role of design and interdisciplinarity. So with all those introductions now done, I'll turn first to Jane. Thanks very much.
Hello everyone, and thank you, Claire, for the introduction. Despite my surname starting with W, I'm very used to being at the end of panel discussions. I'm kicking this one off because I hope some of you may have been with us in the previous panel this afternoon, which talked about peer review under pressure, and we invited the panelists to think about how you might reimagine peer review. And some of the things that I thought I was thinking about that were radical turn out not to be. And we've had some fantastic discussions about really shaking up peer review processes, involving people at a much earlier career stage, thinking about radical kindness and generosity and openness and all sorts of wonderful, exciting, challenging ideas that I hope we can pick up on and develop in this session as well. So my angle today really is going to be interdisciplinary research and scholarship that has a digital angle. As Claire said, I work in digital humanities now, but my background is in history, and I do work with colleagues in modern languages and lots of other areas, but it's all around digital themes and methods that are bringing those different disciplines together. And I wanted to start off really by reading a couple of quotations about the evaluation of digital research. The first of which is from 2006, which was a project I was involved with that was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to look at the problem of how you evaluated digital resources effectively. And our opening paragraph there, it's a short paragraph, don't worry, was the mechanisms for the peer review and evaluation of the traditional print outputs of scholarly research in the arts and humanities are well established. But no equivalent exists for assessing the value of digital resources and of the scholarly work which leads to their creation. A consistently applied system of peer review of both the intellectual content and the technical architecture would serve to reassure academics and their host institutions of the worth of time spent in the creation of digital resources. Establish those types of resource which are of most use and interest to the academic community, and inform proposals to ensure the sustainability and preservation of high quality scholarly material. That was the central challenge that we were trying to address 15 years ago. And moving on to 2014, a piece written by the fantastic US scholar Rupika Rissam called Rethinking Peer Review in the Age of Digital Humanities. And she writes, "For scholars working in digital formats or within digital humanities, conventions governing the gatekeeping of scholarly work feel increasingly mismatched to the digital milieu. Therefore, digital scholarship requires consideration of the factors distinguishing it from print scholarship, along with a new approach to validating scholarship that emerges from and respects the specificities of digital work." So they're broadly saying the same thing 8 years apart. If anything, the position is viewed as having got slightly worse by 2014. And I think both of those standpoints are largely true still today in terms of how we assess this interdisciplinary digital research. And one of the most obvious instances of the problem here for me is every time you log in to the JS system to put in a proposal, a grant proposal for the AHRC, you are asked to classify your proposal. And there's a long list, a really long list with lots of buttons you can press to increase and drop down. Unfortunately, digital humanities is not there. When you search for digital humanities, you get in bright red letters, your search returned no results, please try again. So that's immediately sending a message to people who are working in this field that your work doesn't fit. There isn't a natural place for it. And you then have to make a decision about, well, is it more history than languages, or is it archival research, or where does this go? How do I classify it? And what does that mean for who's going to be assessing it and looking at it? And why is my interdisciplinary research being forced to fit into a bottle that it's too big for? And that gives a sort of sense of outsider status to people who are working in this area, that your research is something other. It's not part of the normal framework of arts and humanities research. So the challenges, I think, are that lack of diversity within peer review systems. As established disciplines change and new ones emerge, the net needs to be cast more widely, and we need to think about updating the way we describe arts and humanities research a bit more responsively. And I appreciate that that's difficult, particularly with online systems, which have taken years to develop and have been with us for years. Minor changes are hard, but I think they're definitely worth doing. Another challenge is the lack of training for peer reviewers. I've never been trained I wasn't trained in how to do peer review until I went on to the HRC Peer Review College, and then had a fantastic experience of a mock panel, and you learn a huge amount about it, and your approach to peer review changes. But not everybody has that experience. A lot of people don't ever get formal training in how to do peer review. And that also, I think, includes honest reflection on bias and on the limits of expertise, particularly where reviewers are assessing their own ability. how confident are you that you can judge fairly something that is outside your field? Are you sufficiently open-minded and open to interdisciplinary approaches? And I think that answer varies for different people. And as I described, also peer review systems which tend to force the prioritization of one disciplinary contribution over another, rather than allowing consideration of the whole. And that unpicks interdisciplinary research in what I think are really unhelpful ways. And the result of all of that really is a rather demoralized community of researchers who struggle to reach outside very niche publishing venues and specific funding schemes that might have digital in the title, for example, because that's where you feel your research is going to be the best fit and will be judged and assessed most fairly. Although again, the pool of researchers available there is a challenge. I think I'm certainly not alone in frequently having to turn down requests to be on panels because I'm submitting an application to that scheme, as is pretty much everybody I know who works in the field. So then you wonder, how is this material being assessed? Where are the reviewers being brought in from? I hope it's a really wide and diverse pool, and in a lot of instances it is, but sometimes the experts are being excluded, or some of them are. So what can we do about this? As I said at the start, I thought I had lots of radical ideas, one of which was open peer review, which researchers in digital scholarship tend to like. It does have problems as well as benefits and is something to think about. But there are lots of other things that I hope we can discuss today. A basic one is to provide peer review training that encourages openness to new approaches and to the combination of methods and approaches from different disciplines. To develop more responsive peer review frameworks, as I said, which can accommodate emerging disciplines. And that might mean that the emerging discipline doesn't emerge, and it's there, it's described there, and you can apply for a bit, but it morphs into something else later on, and we're sufficiently responsive to keep up with the way that the fields are developing. And I think also to draw on and really importantly, formally recognise expertise wherever it's found. And that isn't just in universities. We had a lot of discussion about this previous panel. It's in libraries, archives, museums, galleries, independent research organisations, creative industries, wherever it's found, it should be brought in to make sure that we're really assessing these innovative interdisciplinary projects in the fairest and best way possible. And that's where I'll finish, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jane, for starting this panel, and lots to discuss there, but also some slight, how long can disciplines like digital humanities keep describing themselves as emerging disciplines? I mean, there's a real issue here, and what other emerging disciplines are we losing because there's a struggle to actually get to the point of having to make the argument that you are an emerging discipline. With that in mind, I'll turn to Jenny, however.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire, and thank you, Jane. There's nothing in what you just said that I disagree with. I thought that was absolutely fantastic. I'm absolutely delighted to have been invited to talk today, not least because I get to hear my colleagues, what they have to say as well. But before I start, I just wanted to let you know that I hope that you can't hear background noise. There's the main road behind me, and I'm just aware that if a siren goes off, if an ambulance or a police car goes by, then I might pause for a moment. But otherwise, hopefully it'll be not too noisy. I want to talk about interdisciplinary research and my discipline, English studies mainly, but I also have a few words to say about interdisciplinary peer review. I'm going to start with that because I know we need to do it better, and our main research council, or mine, that relies on peer review, the HRC, knows this too. Mm-hmm. So key question that HRC and other research councils will always be asking is whether their processes of review, and in the case of the HRC, that means their peer review college, deliver the right project for them. So they do ask those questions. And I think it's right and proper that they should ask that. And I'm not sure that they've come up with an alternative to that, but I know that that is a live question. But I'd like to suggest, I see this as a provocation actually, peer review is perhaps not the only problem we often experience it as being in the arts and humanities, no matter how many annoying and misguided peer reviews we receive. not when funding is so tight and likely to get much tighter. And I'd like to remember something that the last CEO of the HRC was keen to remind us in what seem like the not so bad days now of the recent past, that the HRC has or had only 2.8% of the funding of the EPSRC, and that, along with QR, quality-related funding, supports 1/3 of the UK's research community. So there's a lot of people applying for a small amount of funding. And that's why often many of us are not successful, even though we get a fundable grade and quite positive reviews. So for those of us who want to do funded collaborative research, I'd like to turn around the question I've been asked to consider today, which is, how has peer review adapted or not to accommodate disciplinary change and interdisciplinarity in my field? And I want to ask instead, how do we need to explain our disciplines and the contribution they can make to interdisciplinary projects to reviewers who are not our peers? And the question I'm posing to you, to all of us, is who are our peers, or might they be in the future? When thinking about interdisciplinary research, I've always found it useful to keep in mind the distinction that Rick Rylance drew many years ago between near neighbours, disciplines in our own faculties, and distant cousins, disciplines in faculties of medicine, science, agriculture, engineering, etc. Professor Rylance's view, and I share it, is that my discipline, our discipline, English Studies, specifically English Literature, is very good at interdisciplinary research with near neighbours, with historians, with geographers, so on. But we are not so good at working with distant cousins, with engineers, with neuroscientists, with scientists of any stripe, really. Now, there are some very significant exceptions, perhaps especially in the field of medical humanities, where important collaborations are happening across faculty structures. I'm going to name a couple of projects to you so we're upbeat. So one of them is Durham University's Hearing the Voice project, which did involve colleagues from English literature and philosophy as co-investigators. Another ambitious project, which Jane is involved in actually, is the British Library's Living with Machines, which is funded by the AHRC and UKRI and led by a literary scholar, Ruth Arnott. And if you don't know it, it's a 5-year interdisciplinary project using, quote, radically collaborative methods to analyse digital sources at scale to provide new insights into the human impact of the Industrial Revolution. I'm quoting from their website. But I think for the main part that what I've just said, that we are collectively not good in English Studies at working across faculty structures still holds true. And that is the nut I am trying to crack as the Director of Humanities, not just for my own discipline. I've been thinking about it actually for quite a long time, because we need people outside our disciplines who want to work with us to show what humanities and literature can do, and more importantly, because we have a lot to offer and to gain from working with distant cousins. And I'm very, very aware of, this is from 2016, the Stern Review, the idea that grand global challenges of global importance need interdisciplinary perspectives. And that means for me that we have to be at the table when that is being discussed. And yet in my field, I worry that we are rarely at that table. Now, I'm happy to talk about any aspect of my role as Director of Humanities. If you don't mind, I want to tell you a little bit about my own work with distant cousins, and then I will have a confession to make. I've been working or trying to work with distant cousins at Newcastle University for a long time, both as a researcher and as director of the university's Humanities Research Institute. So I suppose you could say that I spend a lot of my time knocking on people's doors. I've been working with data scientists for a number of years, and I co-lead a theme called Text, what is the University Centre for Excellence in Data. I've spent a number of years sitting at tables with data scientists, exploring possible ways of working together, working on a project called Animated Text, trying to provide a through line from humanities directly into data science, and more recently trying to align more closely with their research interests, thinking through topics like from data to decisions. In relation to this, I've also been working with musicologists, digital humanists, bioenvironmental scientists, exploring the possibility of creating an animated bee book for the 21st century, connecting my interest in voice and emotion with scientists' interest in the emotion-like states of animals and insects. We're about to go out for funding. Again, this is our second attempt, I might want to say, pick up on second and third attempts. Connected to my interest in voice and reading, I'm also in conversation with educational psychologists, linguists, speech therapists, and neuroscientists, asking what might an interdisciplinary field of voice studies tell us about how we read. Okay, now all of that might make me sound like a very busy person and a true interdisciplinarian. But now for the confession. I have never managed to get any of my truly interdisciplinary projects with distant cousins, projects I get excited about, externally funded. Only my monodisciplinary and humanities-facing projects have ever been funded. No doubt there are many reasons why not, and chief among which I don't doubt is that bids I put in were not ready, investors did not seem achievable to peer reviewers, or didn't fit the call well, or more likely, were picked by much better, overtaken by much better bids. But here's the thing. There are too few opportunities, I think, to make interdisciplinary funding bids in organically grown responsive mode. The result is that any failure is a setback. It feels like it, and it is. But there is another issue too, and it is on this that I want to conclude. It's not only that there are too few opportunities to apply from the arts and humanities for interdisciplinary funding, in my view, and I can say something about the HRC's 2020 scoping interdisciplinary project scheme when we get to the chat, if people want. But in my experience, we're not an obvious go-to discipline in others' big interdisciplinary project bids. And I experienced this as Director of Humanities, as Director of Humanities Research Institute, as well as a researcher. It is not that our research is not relevant or would not be helpful. And I'd just like to remind you of the ambitious imaginative projects I cited a moment ago, is that we're not visible or audible enough across university structures. At my institution, when we are responding to a large blue skies call, like the recent £10 million Leverhulme Research Centre's call, a fantastic opportunity, as I see it, for an institution to learn about possible collaborations across its structures. Colleagues in the sciences will often think about involving artists, but not usually humanists, and certainly not include scholars without prompting. Addressing that, I think, should be a priority. And I'd like to suggest to you finally that telling a confident story about our current successes, learning from them, knowing what we have to offer, and advocating for interdisciplinary collaboration is the way to shape better future peer review. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jenny. That was really interesting. So to add the perspective of an eternally emerging discipline, digital humanities, to one that is solidly emerged but not visible in its innovation, I think is a really important point. And I think the point about the slowness to build interdisciplinary research projects and the need to enable researchers to develop those projects from an early stage is really important, and that might be related to peer review training as well. So thank you so much. I'll pick those up later in the chat, and over to Barry.
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me, Claire, to join this panel. These are really important issues to discuss. I want to pick up some of the things that have already been said, because they'll be very relevant to where I want to go. So in terms of what Jane was saying, sure, there is this problem with the categories when you try to go onto the JES and report your research. They are 25 years old. They definitely need updating, not just to add digital humanities, but in general. HRC know that, but again, being, as Jenny said, a small council, not so well funded, it's very difficult for all the tasks that need to be done to get done. The other thing that you said, Jane, which I was very mindful of was, when people try to assess their expertise at evaluating projects, I want to look at the other side of the coin. So you were saying people might think they have expertise and they should have a little bit of humility as to whether they can do it. And also they need to be open and generous. I'm also worried about people who have too much expertise, where people see their discipline mentioned and they decide to review very vigorously and aggressively as to whether or not it qualifies as a very good example of their subject area. And of course, you can see that in digital humanities projects where people suddenly see the mention of some special topic in some special technology and say, well, I know all about this, and they've mentioned it. They haven't talked about it enough, so I'm going to give it a very low score. And at that point, I think what we need on peer review is very good chairing. And I think it's underestimated how important the chair of a peer review panel is to say, well, I know they mentioned this, and I wonder whether that's essential to the project, or whether you think it might be a bit of window dressing, but it could actually be set aside and the project can still be done. So I think there's a lot of work to do to understand how people's contributions work on a panel. We did a little bit of exploring of that yesterday with a peer review practice session, which was very, very useful for that. I also wanted to, and I'm going to come back to this area of where the expertise lies. The other thing I wanted to pick up was some of the points that Jenny had made. The HRC do know there's a problem with interdisciplinary peer review, and they have known it for a long time, and we have been saying it to them for a long time, and they've been saying we need to address it for a long time. I've now gone through the lifetime of the last CEO saying it had to be addressed. I hope we don't have to go through the lifetime of this CEO saying it has to be addressed. So I know there's a new team looking at peer review and it's starting, but I want to, when I conclude, I want to give some suggestions, because they've been out there for a while, as to what would make it better. Another thing that was mentioned was by Jenny, how do we engage others with our research? That's absolutely crucial. So you are interested, but how do you engage others to do the interdisciplinary research with you? We have to have better windows of what we can contribute. And certainly, because I do long range interdisciplinary work with the sciences, with the life sciences, neurosciences, neurobiology, psychology, and so on, I did have to put the time in. I had to go to their meetings. I had to listen to their work. I had to understand their methods and ask questions which they thought, oh, that's quite a useful question. And then they eventually saw, oh, you could contribute to what we do. So good interdisciplinary work is hard won. It's slow. There's a process of team building and learning. And I think that has to be recognized somehow in the structure of funding. So there have to be ways in which we can get together and explore in networks and in small projects how we branch out and how we learn to have the same agreed vocabulary and then move and scale to the bigger projects. I saw a lot of disastrous attempts at big projects where people hadn't done that work. And it's often quite interesting, even if they write a good proposal, for very large grants where you interview the team, you could see whether the teams did understand each other and work together. So sometimes you need to have a bit of a CV, a bit of experience of having been together and thrashed these issues out to convince a review panel, oh, you really do know how to do this, and you're going to go ahead and do it. Another thing that Jenny mentioned, and I think it bears underscoring here, which is, you mentioned Durham's Hearing the Voice. I think that is a model, and I wish everyone would look at it, of how to do very, very good, innovative, genuinely interdisciplinary, interconnective work. And there are two things that make that possible, I think. One was that the team really did take a lot of the setting up time to discuss how to get that project framed and right. Even once they got the award, they thought of how they were going to work together. Secondly, managing an interdisciplinary project. You could have great researchers who are ready to go, but the manager of the project is really crucial. Someone who has experience of working across the disciplines, someone who really knows how to bring the best out of different teams and help them to talk to each other. And that happened in Durham. Second thing that happened in Durham, and Durham has been very successful in my theme area, science and culture, and also from the Wellcome Trust, because they have institutional structures that support it. They have processes. institutionally, academically, and administratively, and in terms of financial resources that made it possible to do this. So again, that might be something that's going to have an influence on whether we're successful when we put in bids. So, we need to look at the whole ecology, the whole research landscape when we're thinking about whether peer review is working or not. Other things may stand in its way. All right, so finally, I want to talk about what works and what doesn't, because I think we've known this for some time. So the person who set up those institutional structures at Durham, Tom McLeish, who was director of research, he's now at York, he's a physicist, was professor, was director of research. He and is on the Ordered Universe project with medieval historians, very successful project. Again, wonderful example, almost my sort of poster example of really good long-range interdisciplinary work with humanities. He and I contributed a chapter to a British Academy report called Crossing Paths in 2014. Long time ago, 2016, I think it came out, but we started in 2014, long time ago. And there we talked about evaluation of interdisciplinary research. And we said the following: many projects come to panels and don't get funded because they have assembled a set of experts from the contributing fields where each expert treats it as an application in their discipline, and it gets doubly, triply filtered out. It's like, no. And we said, what you need and what you're trying to evaluate, the core of evaluating a good piece of interdisciplinary research is that emerging kind of content that is not reducible into any of the parts and cannot be expressed by any of the parts alone. There's something that emerges and that's created by the interdisciplinary working. So what we need is to have reviewers who understand how to evaluate that. And our proposal was, please make sure on peer review panels that are looking at interdisciplinary applications that you have people who've had experience of being on or running interdisciplinary projects who can speak specifically to that topic and sometimes remind everyone on the in the panel about what they're there to evaluate to get that emerging part. The other thing I think that happens is that we have when we try to do that, we need to recognize that good interdisciplinary versus poor interdisciplinary proposals are not about how good the quality of the researchers are who are contributing and how good their work is. We see excellent people. We see wonderful, examples of tremendous scholars in their discipline, tremendous scientists in their field. But if it doesn't have a plan and it doesn't have a way of describing how they're going to contribute something that's a significant interaction, better and more than the parts, it may not be funded. And for that, another improvement for research councils is you need to improve the criteria by which you award interdisciplinary research. I mean, when I joined as theme leader for science and culture, I stopped just letting them put out calls and said, look, we need some criteria. And one of the three other criteria, innovative, of course, that has to be there, reciprocal, to have significant interaction, not to have any discipline, whether it's from humanities or from the sciences, using the other as a service industry. We need to understand how our advances or technology will be accepted by society, plug in some humanists, or maybe topics, dare I say it, in English literature that say, we already know what we think, we want scientists to confirm that reading is about empathy. So can you just come along and do that? This is not showing the kind of exploration where nobody owns the topic and you might produce something that emerges that's new that neither of you could do alone or have thought of before. And that's the goal that we're looking for. So better criteria, development of skills, train in peer review people to also do interdisciplinary reviewing, and that needs good chairing. Leadership is important for interdisciplinary work. People who can bring others, can see the strengths and the weaknesses of different contributors, but can sort of weigh them in the right way so that people really do contribute. I'll end here, but say for 5 years I was on the Volkswagen Stiftung's panel for Freigeist fellowships, 5-year early career research fellowships. They had to be interdisciplinary, wide range of disciplines. I sat around the table with about 18 other colleagues from a huge range of disciplines. And what was nice was we were given time to meet before as a panel, discuss the criteria, discuss how we would try to implement and think about them. And we found a common and a shared language. And the funny thing is, to come back to Jane's point, if you're open and generous, even if it's not in your field, boy, can you tell this is a good application. The research questions are clear. They're made accessible to people not in that discipline alone. And the plan is obviously understandable. So I think there are some lessons for the training, there are lessons for the reviewers, and there are lessons for institutions. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry. That was a great summary of some of the key pressure points on getting a successfully funded interdisciplinary project up and running. Time, openness and a generosity at assembling people, training, chairing, good chairing. I really appreciated that. And something else that you said that I think we hadn't yet emerged in the conversation is that it's to the benefit of institutions to put in structures that can develop these kinds of initiatives, because funding follows it. So, you know, that seems so really critical that there are rewards here. I mean, I take the point, and we know it. We know that there are real financial pressures on the system, and I don't want to minimize that. Yes, everybody knows that, but nevertheless, there are ways of trying to kind of maximize your benefits within a very competitive system. So our final speaker, Teal, welcome, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks to colleagues. I've been making lots of notes, listening intently, so I think there's some amazing opportunities in terms of this discussion on how we might be able to impact ways of thinking about peer review. But as a typical designer, I'm going to come at this from a slightly different perspective as well. And maybe look at interdisciplinarity in relationship to the art and design sector, but primarily design, because that's my kind of home discipline, as it were, if I had to peg myself. But design in relationship to interdisciplinarity. I don't think you can have interdisciplinarity without disciplines. So I think, you know, there's some interesting kinds of discussions around that in relationship to peer review and some of the things that you were saying, Barry, as well. But just to kind of say, maybe remind us some of the points that have been made that I've picked up on that relate to some of the things I'm going to be saying. So Jane's point, where the message is that some work doesn't fit, and those ideas of categories, and that, you know, we don't see ourselves particularly within some of those categories. And so it's exclusionary rather than inclusive. And I think that's a really important point. I think Jenny's question is, why do we keep needing to explain our discipline, and how do we explain our discipline to others who we may want to engage with, or we may actually need something from, like funding, in order to progress our research. And Barry, both your points about hard work and the ecology, absolutely, completely agree with that. Maybe I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. But what I think I want to bring to this discussion is not only peer review in relationship to research, but peer review in relationship to publishing. Because I think that is another aspect of that kind of life cycle of what happens with all the hard work that you're engaging with, and how that moves through this ecology, these ecosystems, and what that actually means. So what I've got to say, I've got 3 questions here, and then a point to add to that, is really what this discussion has to do with peer review and intent. So if we kind of put our thinking hat around kind of journals, books, exhibitions, screenings, performances, other kinds of research outputs, how do we understand what the intention of peer review is, and how is that framed within the editorial positioning or the call for research expressions of interest and funding applications and so forth. So intent and positioning and how we understand that and the clarity of that is really important. Then we might ask, what are the ways in which peer review processes reflect that intent and for whom? I think anytime we talk about peer review, as has been alluded to with my colleagues, it's political. It's not just something that we do straightforward and we accept. There's lots of ins and outs. There's biases, there's ethics, there's political positioning, there's strategies. I mean, research strategy committees, I think, in every university that I've been involved with anyway. And then my third question, just to kind of put on the table, is really, what does this mean for hybrid publishing or hybrid research? I'm changing interdisciplinarity into hybridity, but also emerging disciplines and practices that aren't necessarily text-based in origin, but nonetheless are making significant contributions to their field or fields or disciplines. Again, things we can talk around that. And Jane, this comes back to some of the points I think that you were making as well. So that's been those three questions, particularly in my experiences of being involved with journals as an editor, but also in terms of, as my colleagues are, in terms of peer reviewing for research proposals and so forth, that these are things that I think we need to review now. And as we kind of look at this post-pandemic landscape, this is the opportunity, which I know many people are saying, but I think, come on, guys, let's really make this our opportunity for change and not just give lip service to it. So forums like this, I think, are incredibly important. And to those that are participating in the webinar, I hope, they are going to really drive some of these new initiatives and new ways of thinking. So that comes down to the kind of second aspect that I wanted to bring to this discussion. And it's really a consideration of the complexities of what is essentially an ecosystem of peer review. And Barry, this relates to I think, what you were introducing. And I'm not sure, and I don't have the answer to this, what the easy way to kind of disentangle what I see as three main stakeholders, for lack of any other word at this point, in this particular ecosystem exercise, and where the academic potentially sits within all this. And I think if you can think of three overlapping circles, think of a good communication model, and the academics right in the middle of these, the intersection of these three circles, as publishing, the universities, and then government, ref, professional bodies, the kind of institutional infrastructures that demand, quality, benchmarking thresholds, and so forth. So I think those three circles, the academic in the middle, is something I think we need to problematize. So just for example, when you start talking about intent and for whom, if you're thinking about universities, many of which still have yet to kind of recognize the workloads involved in what we recognize as service, and that is being the peer reviewer and engaging in our communities of practices and engaging in research councils and so forth in the peer review colleges. But also in terms of how it's been institutionalized, particularly in the US, which I've had some experience with, where American university tenure promotions are really basing their criteria on very specific aspects of peer review. Everything has to be double-blind peer review. So whilst I think that is important, I think now we have an opportunity to kind of rethink different kinds of institutional practices that set parameters for us in relationship as an academic to publishing and to the other kinds of professional threshold markers that we engage with. Now, why am I saying all this? We kind of know all this, I think, in terms of our individual disciplines, but I'm just bringing it back to the debates that are taking place within the art and design sector, where I think continuing to interrogate and redefine forms of creative practice that might be accepted for peer review. And so the convention of the written submission has its place and remains important in field building. But what do you do with creative practice where the outcomes themselves take different forms, formats, modalities? The full range is there. But also in terms of peer review, how can you really engage with not knowing who that individual is? So in a written manuscript, you can extract the person's name and institution and look at the subject and the content. But it becomes a little bit more difficult when you're talking about creative outputs in terms of particularly communities of practice whom, or it is quite small. People know each other, and kind of the visualization or the audible nature of something that's been done in terms of the research is much more recognizable. So I think for these emerging fields or disciplines, such as design specifically, I think where it's really important that we look at intent in terms of assisting in terms of field building, but also in terms of kind of equality, parity, inclusion, and so forth. And just to give a couple of examples of that. So when we were working on the Journal of Visual Communication, one of the things that we were very keen to do was to introduce visual essays. And those visual essays, we spent a lot of time on it. We did a special issue about visual essays to really interrogate those kinds of opportunities. But we began to think about how do you review something that could be easily recognized in terms of peer review, and who are the peer reviewers for these visual essays. And I think for graphic design, visual communication in particular, we always have the tensions between professional practice as practicing designers working in commercial context and the academic aspect where you're looking at a certain kind of criticality and scholarship. And so peer review doesn't necessarily need to reside in one or the other. And it comes back to some of the points, Barry, I think you were talking about in terms of kind of this integrated nature as well. But I put the profession in this equation, not just different disciplines as well. So kind of coming to the end of what I have to say, I think there is really something quite important and exciting in talking about interdisciplinarity, but it does bring those challenges into how we consider images, still or moving, artworks, critical reflection, sound performance, visual essays. How do we subject those to the quality criteria set by a journal or a research council? And how do we engage with those in the different kinds of formats in which they might be presented? And really, what do we even mean by interdisciplinarity? Art and design always talks about it being interdisciplinarity, but it's within itself, it can be interdisciplined. But within external aspects, there can be distinct disciplines through which we engage with and collaborate with quite effectively. So just to kind of end, imagining future scenarios. As designers, we're very interested in what ifs. So not just about what ifs, but how. So how can you peer review for critical feedback in a more open and transparent way that foregrounds learning? As emerging disciplines, as early career researchers, even as established academics, there's always room for feedback that is giving us a learning aspect rather than a yes, no, you're in or you're out aspect. And I know, many of the journals we're involved with and the research councils are being a little bit more proactive in this area as well. My second kind of question around this, is there a more conversational way to gain critical feedback? Can we crowdsource? Can we look at collaborative methods, which are supportive yet rigorous, and against the criteria and the intent around that that we need to look at? And then finally, coming back to ecosystems. So how can we look at ecosystems which represent a more equitable dialogue between publishers, universities, and systems of accountability? And I think just really looking at organizational management and infrastructures and communication between those three entities could go a long way to impacting how we engage with peer review. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Teal. I'm so grateful that you raised the whole issue of publications. I think that's because it does kind of close the circle and the journey. I mean, we were in an earlier panel, we were reminded that one of the other beneficiaries of successful peer review is the publisher, whether commercial or academic publisher. And there's a whole range and ecology of publications out there. And I really take that point. It seems that we are, as a panel, ready to push for more radical radical change in our peer review systems, and we are really ready to push for openness and transparency. And I love the idea of really experimenting with the ways to give feedback and peer review. I think that's a really valuable point. I'd also like to make the point that with the speed with which disciplines change and practices change across disciplines. So in my work, I'm an early medievalist, but I've recently started experimenting with the visual essay of all things, because it enables a form of communication and learning that can't happen. It happens differently in that space, and it really enriches both an engagement and the research. So I think there is something about the unevenness. I don't know how you capture that, but there is something about the way in which change happens quite quickly and unevenly across disciplines. So it's not just emergent or established disciplines, but there's the mobility of disciplinary change that I'm particularly fascinated by. And I'm also, and that reminds me of something else that has been in the air in all of your, though not quite so explicitly, in all of your presentations, which is that the peer reviewer tends to be experienced, tends to therefore be of a certain career trajectory. And so there is a time lag here. They did their training 10, 15, 20 years ago, keeping track. So we need early career researchers to intervene in the system faster, because they're the ones who are the future. So I think that's how we achieve that in the ecology that we've currently got. I'm using Barry's term here. I think it's a real challenge. So with that in mind, I'd like to sort of open up the panel for discussion now, and perhaps start with that question about how can we track change across disciplines, or who does it? And this is a form of the who is the peer reviewer, or who are we, and how are we related to the disciplines and interdisciplines in which we work. So how does that intervene? How do we track change across disciplines? Is that even valuable to do? Jenny, maybe I'll start with you.
I'm just thinking that one through, Claire. I mean, I just think that I'm worrying about this a bit, because I just think the HRC already tracks change within some disciplines, maybe not digital humanities, but it has its special groups, and they stay in touch. The British Academy organise their thinking around disciplines in the same way. Maybe Barry can talk to this, but there's that interdisciplinary space and how that is changing.
Yeah.
I think about our discipline, Claire. So there was a view, I mean, 20 years ago when I started out, everybody thought they were interdisciplinary because they read stuff that other disciplines had written. Whereas now, the really exciting work is in that space that Barry was talking about, yes, where people come independently and bring their skills, and then the melding of that is what's really exciting and transformative. And but actually, how are we keeping up with that?
Yeah.
How are we as disciplines tracking that?
Yeah.
So that we understand how we can do that and are doing it.
Yeah.
And how are the research councils learning from that? And I was really struck by something that Barry said. I've been on and off HRC Advisory Board for many years, since, well, 2012, and under 3 CEOs, and the issues are always the same.
Yeah.
Same discussions.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, wouldn't it be good if we could actually finally change things?
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you on that, Jenny. I think that's that, and thank you for that clarification. I think that's really important. You know, I do feel like we've been talking about this for far too long. I was a member of the very first peer review college at the HRC, and so it is the time. I think there is a kind of critical mass, and it's trying to push people over, isn't it, into that space. Barry, do you want to pick up on this, the comments so far? Jenny's
yes. Yeah. I think Jenny's absolutely right that each successful interdisciplinary project, especially when they themselves develop and they secure further funding, they are changing the research landscape, and it's keeping track of them. When they do a good job and they convey the interest and enthusiasm to people who are either participating disciplines or surrounding them, like hearing the voice, I'll still give Charles huge credit for that, then things happen. One of the things that we put into our criteria for large grants was, as well as innovative and reciprocal, was potentially transformative of the participating disciplines. And I took that quite seriously. I mean, the idea is that, if you really are doing something that is genuinely innovative and is moving on in methods or research questions or whatever, you kind of hope that the discipline that person comes from, will also sort of start to shift and move, and not just in the humanities, also in the sciences. And I'm writing our final report for the science and culture theme, and I'm giving examples of that, ways in which they are revising practice because of these interactions. So I think those keeping track of changes, they do flow from those successful projects. Just say two quick things, one about publishing and one about early career researchers. Yes, you're right. We don't want, rather old lags sitting on these projects and saying, oh, this sounds jolly good. I have no idea what they're talking about. Remember, we are training, we have now funded quite a lot of very, very good early career researchers as PIs running interdisciplinary projects. And the future leadership scheme with UKRI is doing that. They're going to be the people we want to call upon. I mean, they're already fantastically successful and busy. We want them on panels. They're very close to the ground in the action. And then in terms of publishing, Teal, it seemed to me that, God, journal editors are just desperate for something a bit more innovative than what we might call standard journal fodder. And so, interdisciplinary, publishing a good interdisciplinary piece in a disciplinary journal just sort of lets some air into it. And I know lots of editors who in philosophy think, oh, thank God, something new is not just a continuation of the same old, same old. So that's another way in which publishing kind of moves. But I also agree with you that to do good interdisciplinary work, you have to start from a strong disciplinary base. Good fences make good neighbors, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I could turn to Jane at this point, because there is picking up on that point, both of disciplinarity, trying to establish the discipline of digital humanities, but also the interdisciplinary nature of it, because it seems to me from the account that you gave, there's a real failure to track disciplinary and interdisciplinary change in your area of research.
Yeah, I think it is starting to change. It's definitely improving. But I think the experience that Barry was talking about with journal publishing of some enlightened journal editors who are delighted to let in these new approaches and interdisciplinarity, I think there are people on the other side of that with stories about their complete failure to publish interdisciplinary work in the venues of their home discipline, and are forced to publish in quite niche venues that they develop themselves, or to create whole new publishing venues because the work is not in dialogue, allowed to be in dialogue with what's happening in their home discipline. Because yeah, I completely agree. I share that view that your home discipline is your good starting point for this interdisciplinary work. I think a really positive development, as Jenny, you mentioned the Living with Machines project that Ruth Arnott is the principal investigator for, and a really important strand of that project, and I think it's probably the biggest humanities-led interdisciplinary project that's been funded in the UK. And one of the strands of that is to reflect on their interdisciplinary working and what makes for a good interdisciplinary project, and to publish that and share that with the research community and back to the funders, because it is such a flagship project. And I hope that that direct experience of what does and doesn't work, and what you can and can't do to work in really effective interdisciplinary ways, will be a real important output of that project, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what they're doing. I also am very much in favour with bringing in early career researchers. I think the leadership fellows are fantastic, but I would also like to cast the net more widely to the people who don't end up getting that very small number of leadership fellows, because I think you said, Claire, that's where the next changes are coming from. But we also need to protect those people in the system, because we're already talking about in previous panels how overloaded everybody is with peer review, how much things are under strain. Precarious early career academics have got enough things that they're being told they have to do in order to get effective careers. But if we are going to involve them in these discussions and in changing peer review and really shaking it up, then there has to be recognition and reward and encouragement and support for the people that we bring into that, rather than just loading on another task for them to do. So I think those are my kind of responses to those discussions.
Thanks very much, Jane. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat here, and there's been some very interesting and thoughtful comments and questions. One to Jenny about from Mary Fraser, thanking Jenny for her honesty in accounting for your successes and failures in research funding. And I think this is part of the issue, isn't it? What do you do when your project is unsuccessful? Do you publish what you have all anyway? Do you go elsewhere? You apply again? And most crucially, I think, what happens to the team that you've developed?
Yeah. Okay, I thought it was a really good question. I was going to trying while we had time to answer it in the chat, but I'll do it now. Keep everybody together. Just carry on talking. So I don't really worry about not now. I did at the beginning. I don't worry now about those rejections. I just sort of take them on the chin a bit, as much as I can. I did say it is a step back. You think, oh, I still haven't got it right. But I want to remember how limited the funding is. And I've sat on panels where really good projects do not go forward for funding. It is really hard, it's really challenging. Just keep that in mind. But for me, the process of bringing a bid together is itself interesting and exciting, because you learn about different perspectives, and what doesn't work will change into something else, or even if you don't go out for funding again, you carry the knowledge that you've gained with you. And I just feel for me, it's a wonderful way to keep your academic worldview expanding. So
thank you, Jenny. I'm nodding because I'm thinking this is related to openness and generosity, but it's also related to the ways in which we need to properly embed and collectively peer review in all its dimensions into our knowledge formation and production. Yeah, it is part of success or failure. It's part of the process of producing new knowledge, and that needs to be acknowledged. With that in mind, there's been a lovely comment. I think it's from Wendy Skays. Hello, Wendy. Long time no see. But about the shifts in definition of interdisciplinarity, and depending on whether you're in a European context, a UK context, or indeed a much broader international context. Now that seems to be something that I think is really important to bear in mind as well, and it is part of the broader ecology, isn't it, or the broader landscape of interdisciplinarity and peer review. And if I can turn to you, Teal, I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, both as a kind of journal editor and you know, as a scholar and a designer yourself.
No, I think it's a really good question. I think, again, it kind of comes back to this idea of intent. And, you know, a lot of these funding calls have, you know, kind of thematic or kind of very subject-oriented areas. And so I think when you're looking at interdisciplinarity, you're having to ask yourself, in what ways might an interdisciplinary team of person X or subject X, Y, Z be able to help resolve that particular challenge that's been presented in terms of the research question. And so I think I really like the idea of interdisciplinarity being fluid and flexible and responsive, rather than locking it down and saying interdisciplinary is 1 + 1, or interdisciplinarity is 1 + 2. But it could be, as I was suggesting within the art and design sector, we talk about interdisciplinarity within art and design. So what's that? You know, or interdisciplinary in relationship to working with healthcare, or working with counterterrorism, or working with, you know, whatever. So I think it's really about just kind of looking at what's required, and oftentimes just kind of reassuring yourself that you're going where the best expertise fit might be. And then the question is, how do you actually bring that together effectively? So that's where leadership also comes in, and how teams are created and how teams work together collaboratively.
Thank you, Teal. I just wish this is being recorded. I think I'll go back and quote that because I thought that was a great summary. Go where the expertise is and try and capture it. There's a long comment in the chat. There was a couple of comments in the chat about how do you train for interdisciplinarity, and how do you train openness and generosity? And I think those are really good questions. And there's also a comment from Anna Tam, which is about, follows on from Barry's comment about having too much, you know, the worry about being too overly expert, or I think I might put it into kind of a niche expertise that you can't, you know too much about a particular area. So, and the risk of peer review systems that aren't fluid and flexible is that that those bad practices get reinforced within the system. So if I'm repeating existing bad patterns is the phrase that I'm pulling out of Anna's comment. So Barry, do you want to comment on that, or anybody else indeed? I mean, just put your hands up and we'll work with it.
Happy to comment on that. I just put into the chat the Ref 2021 definition of interdisciplinarity, which I had a hand in writing. And I tell you, Teal, we struggled and struggled, and we had about 6 or 8 meetings where we looked at every potential. We really did think about art and design and other places. We were often talking about it emerging out of disciplines, but several colleagues there wanted to say there's something that doesn't even emerge from other disciplines, which is interdisciplinary, and we've got to capture that. So it's hard. I think that's why I like thematic research, because you say, here's an issue, here's a topic. Who do I need? Which expertise, what sort of expertise do I need? Who's going to make a contribution? How's it going to work? How are we going to manage those contributions? So I agree with you. That's a sort of designer kind of thinking that I really like here. Let me come back to the main question that you threw to me, Claire. So yes, there are, somebody asked about, personality. we were in the early days of Volkswagen on a panel with a colleague from physics who just kept saying, but where are the science and nature journals? I want to see more science and nature journals in people's CVs. And we just kept telling him, it's not just about science and nature journals, until a near Nobel Prize winner in physics said, oh, I would be disappointed if they only published in science and nature journals. So we moved him on. But but there are people who just get an EDA fix. Training will help. Talking to Anna. Anna was at our meeting yesterday, and it actually raised one of the issues that we went through and worked through and discussed. And I think Anna was alert to the fact that some proposals may mention something as a little bit of window dressing, and you might punish them for that, because you might say that's window dressing and you haven't really shown you've got expertise to do this, and it might get hammered. At other times we might think, yes, it's window dressing, but the generosity might be to say, does it really seem central to the topic? Or even if they didn't do that, could they still do the project? And this comes back to a more general point, which I think a few people have raised, and I heard it from Jenny and from Teal as well, how much better it is if we can help people improve their bids before they're looked at. And funding councils with money and funders with money and confidence, and who are not under the government hammer, like the Wellcome Trust, like Volkswagen and so on, they can call people in, they can talk to them, they can help them. They want to help them develop the best version of their proposal, and they'll sometimes get some feedback saying, I wouldn't concentrate on that. I think this is where the juice is. And why don't we do that? well, it's costly and it takes up time, but also I think there's a conservativeness and a fear in UKRI funded councils. We've got government money, we have to be so stringent. If we talk to people, we might be biasing the outcome. And so, we have to be very clean hands. But it doesn't, as Jenny said, you just get thumbs up, thumbs down, and you don't really get an insight into how could this have been a better proposal and who could have helped. So I want us to think in changing peer review, how can we have room for that intermediate stage? Because I know on Wellcome Trust panels I sit on, it makes a huge difference.
Just to, if I can come into that, Barry, and just give a shout out to Professor Paul Rogers, who was the AHRC Design Leadership Fellow. And I was on the advisory panel for the 3 years of his fellowship. And I think it was a really good model of his intent to focus on early career researchers. And he did kind of a roadshow around the country, and it was so successful, they did it again, of working with early career researchers and even established researchers in workshops that use kind of design strategies and techniques to think through research proposals. And really help individuals interrogate what they wanted to do with their proposals. So I think there are things in place, but I completely agree that the sharing of good practice across disciplines, again, that's that kind of blockage of communication, which I think we can really benefit unblocking, which we're obviously doing here today as well.
Yeah.
Jane.
Just wanted to come in very briefly on the question of training openness and generosity. I mean, you can't fundamentally change people's personality types, obviously, but I think peer reviewers can be given a toolkit of the things that might be influencing their decisions. So is it the fact that I know too much about this? Am I judging it too harshly because I know too much about one aspect of it? Have I, if for a journal, have I looked at whether this is a journal with a high impact factor or not when I'm judging how I can read this particular piece of work? So what are the kinds of things that might be swaying your decision making around things subconsciously a lot of the time? And I think just being reminded about that every time you go into peer review, what is it? Have I had a bad day today? Is that why I'm being tough on this? So I need to step back and wait and look at it tomorrow. So I think there are things that can be done to help you get into a more open and conscious about your bias, because we've all got biases, way of approaching peer review.
And I think that would, Jane, thank you. I think that would be a really helpful thing to bear in mind every time one is reviewing, actually, in whatever position. And I think that comment there is always, again, about how you recognize, embed, reward peer review within all the practices that we work in. I think that's that's really important. I'm also struck by Teal's point about the fluidity of interdisciplinarity. It's fluid, it's mobile, it's always changing. And therefore you don't want one system of peer review, right? You want multiple. The ecology of peer reviewing needs to be fluid, mobile, and responsive as well. And I think that would be a really helpful a way of thinking about it. Final comment from Catherine to all the panelists and attendees, and I'm conscious that we're about to close our session, but the intent of peer review really matters. Yes, Teal, I think you've really hit something, a nerve here, and the mirroring of peer review internally to universities in order to control numbers of applications to funding councils per institution has many negative elements. I mean, I think Jenny was touching on that in a kind of more positive way, but nevertheless, the kind of cost of peer review institutionally means that ideas don't always get a proper airing beyond a very small set of people. And I think that something that's I've been aware of throughout this entire week, in fact, but particularly in this panel, is the importance of using systems and processes that embed equality and diversity and transparency, fairness and openness in everything we do is the only way we can get away from the inequities of universities that are better funded or weaker funded. So this is Jane's point about recognizing excellence of the work in it wherever it emerges. Right. So with that in mind, I'd like to conclude by thanking our audience and thanking our panelists for what has been an extremely thoughtful and very, very focused and enriching discussion, and concludes a very good whole week, in fact. I'd also like to thank Gemma Dormer, who's been behind the scenes. And I'd also like to think we need to do this again, because this conversation can't keep repeating itself. So I think there has to be some next steps. And I think Jane's nodding away at me. I know that, so that's our next task, I think. And with that in mind, thank you so much. And I hope you have a good weekend and a good evening, because we have got a bit of a holiday coming for some of us, at least those of us who are in England and the other nations of the United Kingdom. Thanks very much, and bye for now.